We're good.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our regular council meeting for Monday, September the 13th. We'll call the meeting to order. And to begin, I would ask that if you're able, you stand and join with us for the playing of the national anthem.
Grammarly helps make your writing clear and concise.
All right, thank you. I'd also like to take an opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, including the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Chippewa, and the people of the Three Fires Confederacy. Before we get started, are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest? Okay, I don't see any. So we'll move right in. So before we get on to the regular part of the agenda this evening, we are joined by Fred Dean and Nigel Belchamber of Amberley Gavel Limited. These two gentlemen, as most of you will probably know, are considered esteemed experts in the municipal sphere, and we're lucky to have them with us tonight to impart some of their wisdom. I think the plan is you gentlemen are going to provide a little bit of training and touch on, probably a high level at least on 4 or 5 key topics. So I'll keep my comments brief and turn it over to you, and look forward to hearing what you have to share.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I rather like that description, don't you, Fred? Esteemed experts.
I wasn't sure if it was esteemed or steamed.
Yeah, it wasn't either, but I'll go with esteemed. We'll give him credit, Mayor credit for that. I'm going to share a screen with you, and we'll just run through the materials there. So this is what we're going to do tonight or this afternoon and into this evening, is a program that'll take us about an hour and a half roughly, with time for questions. So it's now 5, it'll be about 6:30, maybe 6:35, I think, when we're done. And really it talks about roles, responsibilities, and decorum. These are topics that are arising across the province, and probably not surprisingly, given the pandemic and where we are in the term. Many councils were scheduling sessions like this for frequently in the past. They did it live just after a couple of years of the term. The pandemic's kind of changed the schedule on that. But as a result of conversation with staff and with the mayor, we have this presentation for you tonight. The key areas that we run into are the roles, as I said before, and we're in an era of enhanced transparency and intense public scrutiny. The access to the internet, the access to social media, the access to council meetings on Zoom has all changed the political landscape and changed it for the better. It's also changed how we need to respond and how we need to behave and measure. Just a little bit about Fred and I. I'll do it very quickly, or about Fred and me. Fred was Sudbury City Solicitor for 23 years, but he's been in private practice dealing with municipal governments for almost 21 years, or almost all of the 21 years. And so he's got an awful lot of experience from the solicitor's point of view, but he spent the last couple of decades often in the role of municipal coach, whether he's been coaching staff or whether he's been coaching municipal councillors. I've been involved in local government administration since 1977. I've been a CAO, a treasurer, a clerk. I've been a municipal association executive. And as I said before, the mayor said, Fred and I have worked together for the last 2 decades almost, believe it or not, for training for councillors on behalf of AMO, or as closed meeting investigators on behalf of local authority services, or dealing with senior management and CAOs in terms of training. And we've been integrity commissioner. We've actually done stints as ombudsman, and we've done lots of targeted sessions for council. So we've seen a fair bit from Kenora to Kirkland Lake to Cornwall to Kingsville, virtually every part of the province. So what are we hearing from people across the province? Well, this is, it's interesting. Probably this term more than other terms. We're hearing comments like, this is the most dysfunctional council, or meetings need more focus, or, gee, it seems like people are commenting for the sake of commenting, or staff are not respected. We're hearing that members of council sometimes are getting into the weeds, and we'll talk more about that later and when that's appropriate and how it's appropriate or not. There is a concern that we will lose staff. We hear that from people. And there is intense competition, for senior municipal staff with experience. It's province-wide, and quite frankly, senior staff are able to be quite mobile. One of the things is, we're incredibly busy despite or because of the pandemic, probably nowhere more than Shelburne in terms of the growth pressures, but also the pandemic places some unique characteristics on that busyness or that level of activity. Of course, some members are already fighting future elections. That's normal. But the closer you get to the election, the more that might show up. Unfortunately, we've had some people say, if I'd known in 2018 what I know today, I wouldn't have run. That's a bit of a disappointment. And I'm worried that this is going to cost us in many ways. And the last thing we often hear is members are getting involved in bylaw enforcement. We'll talk a little more about that later, because that's a particular concern, and that can backfire. But we can tell you how you can get involved and what your role is. So our objective for the session is really, how can we help you stay out of the weeds, but actually enhance services at the same time? And I think it can be done. We can talk about how to improve the conduct of meetings as well, because there are some key things that will derail or cause an otherwise successful meeting to look in some ways like a failure. And to some degree, how to improve codes, policies, and processes to not only deliver better service, but to avoid citizen complaints. So there's a lot to look at. Fred, I'm going to, at that point, with setting the tone or the table, I'll turn it over to you to talk about roles and responsibilities for a while.
Thanks, Nigel. I think virtually every presentation we do and every council we speak to, this is the #1 topic that people are interested in, and so they should be. I think it really defines the success of a municipality in terms of understanding the roles and responsibilities. Notice this slide, it says provincial legislation. The province has given you, whether you're a member of council, whether you're the head of council or staff, province has given you a job description. It's in the legislation, and I think it's important to have a sense of what the province has intended in creating municipal structure in Ontario. It has defined, I think, in pretty clear terms, the role of elected officials, excuse me, and the role of administration. So I want to take you through that. And I think as a background to all of this, what I consider to be the most important section in the Municipal Act is Section 5. And it was put into the Act in 2003 when it was rewritten. And it basically says that all powers of a municipality shall be exercised by council. All powers of municipality shall be exercised by council and shall be exercised by bylaw. So that's the starting point for everything we're going to talk about today, and indeed in any analysis of local government. So starting at that point, let's get into the role of council. And again, as I say, this is set out in the Municipal Act. As you can see, Section 224 is the section that we're referring to. The first paragraph is an interesting one, and it says that council represents the public. You won't see that wording when it comes to staff. It's council that represents the public. You as elected officials represent the public. And you have an obligation to consider the well-being and interests of the municipality. And in my opinion, municipality has two meanings there. One is your municipal corporation. The other, though, is your community, the community itself. So there's an obligation on individual members of council and council as a whole to consider the well-being and interests. I'm not going to tell the story tonight, but at Sudbury, we had a councillor who was off encouraging people to sue the city, and which the CAO and myself didn't think was a particularly good idea. And we spoke to him, and he ignored us. And so I wrote to our insurer, and the insurer wrote back and said, if this continues, we're going to discontinue the policy in relation to this type of claim, because you are not acting in the best interests of the municipality. So it's a pretty strong indication of where your loyalties have to rest while you are a member of council. The second one is to develop policies and programs in the municipality. This is that decision-making role that council undertakes. Once those policies are developed and they're put in place, council has an obligation to evaluate them at some later date. Usually it's during the budget process, but this development of the policies rests with the municipal council. The third one talks about which services to provide. And I think this one is more important in the context of determining the levels of service. What are the levels of service? And they are determined annually during the budget process, both current and capital, determined by council. And that really sets your policies for the year ahead and where you're going with it. Numbers 4 and 5 start with the same words, and that is to ensure. Not to do these things, but to ensure that they are in place. The first one deals with administrative and controllership policies and practices. And Nigel will talk about controllership in a few minutes. But you have an obligation to ensure that these are in place. Why? To implement the decisions that council makes. So again, that's the reinforcement of this decision-making role. But council has an obligation, and we're going to see how that expands out in terms of where council gets its information and advice with respect to this matter. So first, to ensure is administrative policies and controllership. The second is around accountability and transparency. Council has an obligation to ensure your organization is accountable and transparent. There's a document that I think is of tremendous assistance to members of council, both individually and collectively, and that is you will have a policy, an accountability and transparency policy. Every municipality in the province has to have one. And it will indicate the ways or the things you are doing to demonstrate your organization is both accountable and transparent, and also indicate what those terms mean. Often they get confused and people aren't quite sure, but council, again, gets advice. We'll come to that later, but council has to ensure that your organization is both accountable and transparent. Number 6, maintain financial integrity. The buck stops with council. Council sets the budget. Council gets advice from staff, from the treasurer, from CAO and others. But at the end of the day, the expectation by the province is council has an obligation to maintain the financial integrity. Other duties, there are some, we won't get into it. I guess the best one is emergency. The powers that council and the head of council have around an emergency within the municipality. So that's the role of council. That's it. That's all that the province put in the act in terms of the responsibilities and roles. Notice, interestingly, there is nothing in that about management, day-to-day management of the organization. And I think that's significant. I think, as I said before, council, the province has put up this very clear distinction between the administrative role and the council role. So let's flip over for a moment, if we could, to the head of council. And the head of council in Ontario now is, it's the mayor in many communities, but it can also be the warden or a reeve or a chair. And the powers for each of these offices, the person who is the head of council is equal in all the different types of municipalities, county, region, lower tier, city, town, whatever. So here are the responsibilities. And this first one is not surprising. It's been in the Act for a long time. Preside over council meetings. That's what the Act used to say, but in a few years ago, the province expanded that to indicate that the business of the council has to be carried out in an efficient and an effective way. I think that ups the obligation on the head of council. I think that means the head of council has to have some training in terms of how to chair meetings, how to some of the issues that go along with that, how prepared each head of council is coming to a meeting. It's a higher standard than it ever was before that province has put in place. So the head of council, there's only one exception to the head of council presiding over council meetings, and that's City of Toronto. But every other municipality has the obligation to, the head of council will do it. There's an ability to pass that on now that wasn't there before. But I think the community expects, frankly, that the head of council is going to be chairing the council meetings. Item B is interesting. It's really short. It just says provide leadership to council. And the reason it's important is it doesn't say to the municipal organization. It doesn't say to staff. It says to council. And I think, again, that's the province defining or delineating between the administrative role and the role of decision-making body of the council itself. Item C is, in my experience in municipalities, really important. The head of council represents the municipality in official functions. I know in my experience in Sudbury, the mayor couldn't get to everything and had a system of delegating to various members of council to attend. In my experience, it's just important for the head of council or for a member of council to be present at events. You just need to be there. It's important to do, but the Act puts the obligation on the head of council in the first instance to be there for official functions. member council had to ensure certain things, administrative controllership, accountability, and transparency. The Act puts an obligation on heads of council to provide advice on these matters. And Nigel and I have been doing some work in this area recently. And it's really significant that part of the leadership responsibilities of a head of council is to provide advice on these various aspects. Now, clearly, heads of council haven't been elected because of their ability to provide advice on these various things, particularly controllership. But the head of council should be expected to reach out to others to assist. And that would include the CAO and the clerk and the treasurer, but also the municipal lawyer, the possibly the auditor, to get advice to meet the obligations with respect to these matters that come before council. Item E is a section that has been in the Act for quite a long time, although the wording got changed a few years ago. But we'll come to that in a moment. What does it mean to be the chief executive officer of a municipal corporation? It's been a definition or a designation that has caused confusion to a lot of people. But we'll come back to that in a minute when we get into the duties and responsibilities of a chief executive officer. Other duties, again, the emergency. A head of council has the authority to declare an emergency within your municipality. Wouldn't do it on his or her own, but would do it after consulting the team that you have in place to deal with emergency situations in your municipality. So that, subject to the CEO part, that's the list of responsibilities, and it's substantial for a head of council. And it also puts the head of council, in my opinion, in a very different chair than the rest of members of council. The view from the chair, the chair of the chair, is very different than it is for the rest of council, and it's important, I think, to keep that in mind. If we go to the next slide, Nigel, can you talk to us about this issue of controllership and just what it means?
Sure. Before we jump to this, Fred, one interesting thing it just hit me. The Act talks about the role of council, and that's council as a whole, whereas it talks about the head of council as an individual. So individual members of council under the Act actually have no power or authority on their own, do they?
No, we'll come to that in a few minutes.
Sitting as council. Yeah.
Yep.
So what's controllership? So if you're providing advice on controllership, the head of council is not elected because he or she is an accountant or somebody who's familiar with accounting and insurance matters. If you look for a definition of controllership, it's an unfortunate thing is usually comes up and says it's what controllers and companies do. Well, that's kind of a waste of a definition. But I think it includes a program of risk management that is both for the physical and financial assets for the municipality, how you protect the worth of the municipality, both in cash and non-cash items, how there are suitable internal controls. And internal controls can do with everything from the processing and handling of funds or financial transactions. Today, it's more about transactions than it is actually about cash, or the acquisition or disposition of property, for instance. What are the controls in that process? If you've got a good controllership program, it also includes periodic interim financial reporting. I hesitate to say this, but Walter, when you were first on council some years ago, I suspect it wasn't uncommon to get a list of what that might be described as a list of vouchers or checks or the check register and put that in front of council. What's the amount in the individual checks? That's not interim financial reporting and doesn't even usually fulfill an internal control process. What you really want today is statements of budget to actual, and not just budgets to actual and a numerical difference, but actually a verbal or written analysis of why variances have occurred. Why are we over budget? Why are we under budget? And if we're on budget, is that a good thing? Or are we just lucky to be on budget? It's becoming really important, and the pandemic has really highlighted this for many different organizations. Deputy Mayor Baker, I noticed that, or Anderson, excuse me, I noticed that TTC was reporting what it needs to cover off lost projected revenue this year. So it's an important thing to do, probably quarterly, not monthly, but it's important. And there also needs to be in a corporation a statement of values and ethics regarding financial matters. And it's one that should be recognized by both staff and by members of council, that the funds and the resources that are at the disposal of council and for the use by staff are not theirs. These are funds and resources and assets that have been provided, in effect, in trust for use to the benefit of the citizens, inhabitants, and ratepayers of the municipality. So it's very important that there be this sense of financial controllership throughout the municipality, and it informs the administrative processes in the organization. Fred spoke about the CEO. Prior to 2003, it said the head of council is the CEO. Now it says the head of council acts as the CEO. And then it goes on to define and says acting as the CEO, the head shall, it says uphold and promote the purposes of the municipality. So how does the head know what the purposes of the municipality are? Well, it's established by the bylaws. It might be established by the strategic plan. It might be by the resolution. Certainly it's the decisions of council that determine what the purposes of the municipality are. Upholding them means that when he or she is asked to comment or has an opportunity to comment on the municipal work and the municipal role, that he or she speaks positively about the decisions of council. That kind of responsibility isn't laid on the shoulders of every member of council individually, because we all know of situations where a member of council will say, look, I didn't support the decision of council, I voted against it, and you're never going to convince me based on the information available that it was a right decision. The head of council has a different role. The head of council's role in this is to say something like, you may have seen that I didn't vote for this particular project, plan, or policy. However, council did. The majority of the members of council voted in support of this. Council is a democratic institution, and that's how we conduct business and set policy for the municipality. So I'm in support of this particular decision. And we've got many other important things to do in future. So it's a slightly different role. Another role that is put onto the CEO, or the head of council is acting as the CEO, is to promote public involvement. So, Mr. Mayor, you get opportunities from time to time when something happens, particularly in non-pandemic times, to bring greetings on behalf of the municipality when somebody shows up, or a hockey tournament, or a curling bonspiel, or whatever, or a school graduation. It's a wonderful opportunity to be able to encourage people to volunteer, to get involved, to run for council, to sit on a committee, to take part in some civic function. Again, the head of council's got this ability to be in place in order to do this, and the responsibilities there to do that. It also says that the CEO, as CEO, the head, shall act as a representative of the municipality locally, nationally, and internationally. Now, that doesn't mean, Mr. Mayor, that should the opportunity arise that you get head off to France for economic development venture all on your own initiative. You need council to provide the budget for you to go. But it's not unusual for you as a head of council to be there alongside MPs or MPPs or the premier on occasion, either locally or on the national stage from time to time, or rarely, but sometimes internationally, particularly if there's a firm that's looking to move to your municipality. When I was city treasurer in London, we had an occasion where there had been a firm that had been doing, they'd done 2 years worth of work in order to make a determination to establish a presence in London. And the mayor got involved when I say at the last minute, it was actually to go and meet the board of directors in Germany and shake hands and sign the agreement. All of the work had been done in advance, but they wanted to see the mayor of the community and make sure that the community, the municipal corporation, was solidly behind the work that the staff had done leading up to that. And the last one, foster activities that enhance social and environmental well-being of the municipality. Not only encourage things that are socially positive, but today more than ever, things that are environmentally positive and commit to the well-being of the municipality. More and more opportunities to do that, or more and more expectation that elected officials will be doing that today. So the head of council has this unique set of responsibilities. There's no managerial authority in here. There's no decision-making. It's something that I like to refer to as either being the champion of the municipality, or in some cases it's a cheerleader of the municipality. Some of you will remember the former mayor of Mississauga, Hazel McCallion. Hazel never let an opportunity to go by to say what a great municipality Mississauga was, because of the people that live there and the people that work there and work for the municipality. But it was all about promoting what was good about the municipality and keeping a very positive attitude on everybody's behalf. A really, really important role, besides all of the other things that land on your shoulders, Mr. Mayor. So there's another position you can have. You can create a deputy head of council. And the Municipal Act, let me tell you where the deputy head can come from. One is it could come out of a restructuring order. And a restructuring order, particularly that speaks to the composition of county council. If heads and deputy heads both sit on county council, that's likely out of either a local restructuring order, more likely out of a county order related to restructuring. That's number one. The other one is the discretionary municipal bylaw. And it might be in the procedure bylaw, or it might be a standalone bylaw under section, I believe it's 244, that authorizes council to appoint a deputy head to act in the absence of council. It's not given any extraordinary powers, only those that are in the order or in the bylaw. And quite frankly, at local council, it's usually only in the absence of the mayor. There are some procedure bylaws that designate the deputy head of council to be the chair of committee of the whole, for instance, or chair of closed sessions, just in order to indicate that this isn't council in decision-making mode, this is council in discussion mode. So there's some procedure bylaws that do that, but there's no statutory delegation to a deputy head of council. So one of the things we note, as I said before, the role of the head and members, there's limited individual powers. Doesn't mean there isn't significant responsibility on you as an elected official, but there's limited individual powers to actually do anything or direct anything to be done, with those rare exceptions like emergent declaration of emergency, Mr. Mayor. I hope you carry the emergency plan on your telephone, or you have your cell phone beside your bed at all times. I've been spending some time along Lake Huron, and I've only seen 3 tornadoes drift by in the last 10 days. So these things do happen at certain times a year when you least expect them. Your role as elected officials is a very public role. And in fact, it's probably more public today than it's ever been in my career, my recollection. And because of social media, there's an expectation that you're in the role 24/7. That's quite frankly a dangerous place to put yourself. You do need some downtime, and it's not what's the word, irresponsible to publicly indicate that you don't respond to municipal related calls, for instance, on Sundays, except in an emergency. That's you gotta be careful about that. The premier is always working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 168 hours a week, or whatever the number is. That's his full-time job. For you, these are part-time jobs. It's a part-time role. Don't let yourself get overwhelmed. And just remember, you're neither administrators nor managers. You do have responsibility to evaluate the programs, but that's based on information that you receive from administrators and managers in order to evaluate, those programs. That's their role. Similarly, the development of programs, you're not elected because of your technical expertise. You have an obligation, and you have the capacity to appoint, select, or source appropriate advice to develop those programs. So it's a kind of a complicated role, but there is a sequence to it that is fairly easy to describe, where an issue can arise. You get the best advice you can, whether it's internal or external. You combine that with your personal ethics and knowledge. Collectively, you make a decision. Staff go away and implement, and your job then is to evaluate based on the staff's measurement of the implementation. It's a fairly straightforward, and it's quite a common business model, quite frankly. Fred, do you want to talk about administration and just how they fit in here a bit, and then what the access?
Yeah, let's flip over from the decision-making side to the administrative side. Again, the province has set out some responsibilities, and frankly, 227 of the Municipal Act, I think, is one of the best written sections. It's clear and it's concise, and it's helpful, I think, to understand the difference between the role of members of council and the role of staff. First responsibility is to undertake research and provide advice to council. Well, what is that? Well, simply, I think that's the reports that council receives from staff. Staff does the research, provides a report, provides within that report a recommended motion to be presented to council. And that is coming on virtually every item that comes to council. Staff has an obligation to undertake the research and provide the report. Council has an obligation to receive those reports. And I think it's the foundation, in my experience in municipalities, that the staff reports that are provided on the agendas are critical in terms of council making effective decisions. And the better decisions, or the better reports, are the better decisions that are made by council. So providing advice and undertaking research is key. The second part is, once council makes a decision, staff have an obligation to implement that decision. Whether that decision by council was the one recommended by staff or not, staff have an obligation to implement it. I always saw my role as city solicitor as to provide advice in situations where council may be acting outside its powers. But if council took a staff decision and changed it, as long as it was in the powers that council had, it was appropriate. And didn't happen very often. Most municipalities doesn't happen often, but it can happen. Once the decision is made by council, whatever that might be, staff have an obligation to implement it. The last part of this section says that staff have an obligation to establish administrative practices and procedures. These policies or these procedures, frankly, are not ones council members see. Every department in your organization has a procedural manual or procedures in place to undertake the responsibilities and duties that council has given to them. These are not council policies. These are the day-to-day work policies that allow the administration to undertake the responsibilities that it has. Every municipality may have a chief administrative officer. It doesn't matter what you call this person. They can be the town manager, city manager, chief commissioner. We had that in Sudbury at one point. Can be the town manager, town CAO, or just CAO on its own right. It doesn't matter the title. What matters is in the bylaw appointing this person, and this person has to be appointed by bylaw. The words in Part A, exercising general control and management, have to be within the bylaw, and the purpose is there to ensure that the operation is efficient and effective. Not every municipality in the province has an administrator or a CAO or a town manager. Most do. Very few do not have them. I know of one municipality now that's had a department head team of 5, I think it was, and it's going to a CAO model fairly soon. You need that one person that can provide advice to council, that has the authority and has the responsibility of the administration under them and for day to day. It's an important person, it's an important link between council and the administration itself. Every CAO bylaw I've ever seen has all sorts of other duties assigned, but the key and magic part of it in terms of the CAO is to be found in section 229 and those words in paragraph A. Statutory officers are unique in municipal government, and they are people who are appointed by council. They're appointed by bylaw of council to fulfill the role. And there's some examples set out there. Let's just talk about the clerk just as an example. The province gives municipal clerks in either legislation, statutes, or in regulations, responsibilities. And in the clerk's case, it falls across a whole series of different statutes. And the clerk has the statutory duty, and that's the name statutory officer, to fulfill the responsibilities provided by the province. So that means that a statutory officer has 2 job descriptions in effect. One is the one given by the province, and the other is the one given by the municipality that would be contained in the bylaw appointing the person. The key thing is this: no one can interfere with the statutory responsibilities and duties given by the province. So, for example, the clerk has a responsibility around the municipal election, and council cannot interfere with that, with the exception of one small area. The clerk has the responsibility for the minutes of the meeting to be taken without note or comment. That's a statutory responsibility imposed upon the clerk. Each of those offices has those statutory responsibilities, and it's important to recognize within your organization that these people exist. The chief building official, for example, cannot be directed by council whether to issue or not issue a permit. The Act recognizes that building code issues are a matter of health and safety, and it's the responsibility of this individual who's been appointed pursuant to the legislation. So I think at the end of this process, and we've gone through this pretty quickly, we can see that there's a relationship between staff and council because you're one organization. But that relationship, I think, and how effective it is, sets the tone for your relationship with the community. If there are difficulties between staff and council, that reflects in the community, and the community notes that. The community is aware of that, in my experience. If we put one word on one slide to reflect that, I think the word is respect. It's important to respect the roles that respective roles that each of you have in fulfilling the obligation of running the municipal government. Something new, or relatively new now, is that there is now a requirement for a policy. It deals with the relationship between members of council and officers and employees of the municipality. People read that quickly and they think it's a relationship policy between council and employees, and it's not. It's relationship between individual members of council and the officers and employees of the municipality. You should have that policy in place. It will tie in with your council member code of conduct. As it says on the slide, it's individual. It relates to individual members as opposed to council collectively. Respect, as I said, is the key for individuals, whether you're on the staff side, whether you are on the council decision-making side. It's an important relationship. The really good organizations that I've worked with over the years understand the division between the responsibilities and respect what the other party's doing. I had the chance to work with some fabulous councils in Sudbury. I had the chance to work with some not so fabulous councils in Sudbury. But the key always was, in terms of the successful ones, was a respect between the staff and members of council in terms of the roles that were being fulfilled. This slide, next slide, says it really simply, the roles are different. And it's important that each of those roles be fulfilled in a professional way. And you are under microscope, both members of council and staff, in terms of how you're fulfilling those roles. This is really an abbreviated part of this session. Often we will get into a couple of hours just talking about these different elements and different aspects of the relationship. But we're going to touch on some of the highlights today and move through those.
Fred, this is a bit of a break point in terms of the subject matter. Perhaps if anybody has any questions that they have jotted down or anything that's popped into their mind so far, we'd be more than happy to entertain them.
I can't see everybody's video while the screen shared. I'm not sure if anybody has their hand up.
Okay.
Just speak up if you do have a question. No? Okay.
Carry on, Fred.
Nigel's right. We're moving off in a bit different direction now. And these are some of the observations we've made of municipalities when we've traveled around the province in the last while, virtually around the province. The issue of how you deal with people's complaints or observations or comments to the municipality, I think is a really important one. And frankly, a lot of members of council put themselves into I think a very difficult position by responding directly to these complaints, by setting themselves up as the complaints department. It's not an effective way to be handling the comments that are coming in and the concerns. It's important, in my experience, that they be turned over to staff as quickly as possible, so that there can be a system in place. And Nigel, you may want to talk about this because you've talked about this a lot. A system of work orders or other recording of requests that are coming into the municipality. A lot of municipalities are using a 311 system that allows them to manage this. But I think even back in 2 decades ago, we were taking this seriously in terms of recording them, moving them off the councillors' table onto the staff, and recording how they were being dealt with and how they were being brought back to the member of council when appropriate.
Fred, it's interesting. If you did the tally, the person who solves the most problems for citizens in a municipality is not who you'd expect, but it's the person who is the point person for answering the phone or sits at the reception desk.
Yep.
Because people approach them with issues or questions that start out, how do I, or I want to, or where do I? And that person directs them to the solution. We do a little bit of that with the websites these days, but the question is, how do we get people as quickly as possible to the right person who can solve their problem for them? And that's where, if a complaint comes into a member of council and the member of council then filters it to the department, suddenly we're almost like playing a game of broken telephone, if you remember that game as kids. What we really want to do is to put the individual who approaches you in touch with the person or the process that can solve their problem in the fastest particular way. And that's why the work order system, a lot of municipalities now have requests for service. They don't call them complaints, requests for service, or how do I, or whatever, front and center on their website, so people don't have to hunt for it. It's almost right up at the front in terms of a request. And the benefit of that is that it can generate a ticket, as you might call it, with a work order with a number that can be tracked. And it gets tracked to see when the appropriate department responded and when the appropriate department dealt with the issue and called it completed. People will say, well, wait a minute, don't I remember the success of the former mayor of Toronto, Rob Ford? He returned every phone call, and he visited everybody that asked him to come by. And you're right, he did, or at least he did, apparently did. But I asked staff, I said, so how did that actually work? And he said, well, whenever he could, he made contact with the individual, but right away he would turn that contact over to one of his political staff, of which he had several. And you have to remember that he had a robust political staff, and that staff would then follow through the administrative process with it. He said, but the real benefit of his doing that was not that it necessarily solved problems quicker, but it built a whole list of people that he could call upon for donations or support in his next political campaign. It was in effect building a campaign list. And he was very good at it, quite frankly, by the time he was a councillor and when he was a mayor. But again, in his setup, he had a significant number of staff to support him in that political effort. You don't have that. Some municipalities have gone to a relatively simple method. And I like it, even if you have a work order system that basically has a business card for every councillor with their contact information on the front, and on the back of the business cards are the key contact numbers for municipal departments or whatever your process is to get an issue dealt with. Again, not every contact's in person these days, but what you really need to do is how do we marry up the problem with the person who can deal with it, who can most effectively deal with it. So, and it's going to be different in every municipality, but as members of council, you don't want to get too intimately involved in that process because, quite frankly, you just slow it down sometimes.
Nigel, I just want to reverse the whole situation just for a minute.
Go the other way. Yeah.
One of the things that I saw happen on a fairly regular basis is the member of council would get involved with someone who was seeking a service or wanting to get something corrected.
Yeah.
And it was outside the scope of the municipality. It was a provincial problem. It was a upper tier problem. It was a problem as between neighbors. It wasn't one for the municipalities to solve. The problem of councillors getting into that quickly and not passing it off to staff is that the public tend to blame them for not going and following through with what has to be done. Sometimes that it's important to understand that staff will be able much more effectively to deliver that message than members of council will. And I always encourage council members to turn these matters over to staff, to have it examined, looked at, dealt with, and then have the part of the complaints process, if you will, is that staff get back to members of council to indicate how the matter has been resolved. It's important to do that. And I think the more quickly you do it, and I think, frankly, that should be part of orientation when a new council comes in, how you deal with this, because your telephone and your computer light up with people calling in. And if there's a system in place, it makes it much more effective and much more straightforward.
If you don't mind, I have a question, if you don't mind me interjecting.
Yeah.
Just before you maybe move on to the next slide, I'm hoping that maybe between you and Nigel, if you can provide some examples of when councillors or members of councillors should be taking on complaints or situations maybe where they shouldn't. You talked about, getting too far into the weeds. And the reason why I say that is, and the reason why I'm asking for examples, because I think most people would assume that, look, if there's an issue in the community, the person I'm going to go to is their elected official, right? We voted them in, we put them there. And if I have an issue to deal with, of course, I'm going to contact councillor so-and-so or deputy mayor so-and-so to address my concerns. And so are we saying that when we receive, whether it's a question or a concern, that we shouldn't be attempting to address it in any way other than just passing it on to staff? Or is it okay in certain circumstances to see what they are, and if we can resolve it, then we do that?
Fred, you want to go first, or I can jump in?
No. I think you've got, I affectionately, when I was in Sudbury, referred to the council members who jumped in the pickup truck as the Don Quixote councillor. They would get a call about a culvert or some other issue, and they would be out on site providing advice to the property owner how to reconstruct this culvert, and really didn't have the knowledge and background to do it. I always encourage council to err on the side of referring it to staff. You may be involved with it, but get it to staff and have the discussion with staff, because the odds are staff have dealt with this type of situation previously in other circumstances. I think members of council win far more than they by referring it off to staff and getting a report back. You look like the one who's getting it done, because at the end of the day, frankly, staff are probably going to be the ones to resolve the issue. And if it turns out to be an issue between two property owners, you do not want to be in the middle of that as a member of council. You can't win, because at the end of the day, you're going to say, or staff's going to say for you, we can't do anything about this.
I think it's, if you have a political staff who you can set to solving some of these issues for you or passing them along, then you can welcome complaints coming to you. However, if you don't, I think that that interferes with your limited time that you have to devote to being an effective counselor. One of the things that often happens, and maybe you've not seen it, but I know it's happened dozens and dozens of times. I hear it from counselors all over the place, is that I got called out to take a look at the proverbial culvert. And I got out there, and so-and-so asked me to look at it, and said he wanted to do such and such, and what did I think about it? And the first reaction is say, well, have you checked with the staff to see whether or not this is the appropriate placement for this culvert in terms of sightlines? And then you get this sheepish answer, says, oh yeah, I did. And they told me I couldn't do it. I just wanted to see if I could get you to do it for me. Don't get yourself caught in that sandwich, because that can happen all the time. Or you'll get called in order to deal with a dispute on fences. And I don't know whether you have a fence bylaw or you have fence viewers or whatever your fencing provision is, but you can end up getting caught in a dispute where they already have the advice from your staff that's appropriate advice. So you want to be careful about that. Yes, I know that people get their knowledge about municipal councillors and what their role is from, well, where do they get it from? They get it from TV. Some of them haven't had any updates since the Dukes of Hazzard, and think that everything operates like Boss Hog, Mr. Mayor, and you need a bigger hat. But I think there is an expectation that you can solve all of these problems, but you don't have the individual authority to do it like Boss Hog did, or an American mayor system does. And you don't necessarily have the political staff to back you up. So I think it's a very dangerous thing to do, is to welcome those contacts. But the best advice is to make sure you know how to get them rooted in a particular way. And if you route a problem to a department head, then you should expect that there will be a follow-up or a response back to you from the department head when the issue is solved. I mean, that's courtesy, and that's appropriate process. But on the other hand, it's in terms of trying to manage a complaint through the system, I don't think you have the time for that. In fact, it actually slows down the answering of a lot of complaints in an organization if they have to be checked back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So I think you need to make the assumption that most problems are solved by the first contact with the appropriate staff person, and you get dragged into them, and it's dangerous when you get yourself dragged into it. You need to delegate it as much as possible. Just what happens when the CAO gets a call about a complaint. The first thing you do is you check with you listen, but you ask if the person's contacted the appropriate staff. And if they haven't, you pass the contact over and make sure that they are. Get to the person who can solve the problem. That's our advice consistently.
I think it's important, though, that the starting point is people will call their counselor, the elected official, and I encourage that. I think that's a good thing, but it's how you deal with it once you've received it to make sure that it gets handled, that there's a system to pass it off, and there's a system to report back to you in terms of what the issue is. And as I say, if it's not a municipal issue, it's better that the staff deliver that message than it is a member of council.
Yeah. Does that address your question, Deputy Mayor? Okay. If it's a bylaw enforcement issue, Fred, how far in the weeds should council get?
The best advice, and the advice I always gave members of council, is stay out of it. If it's becoming a bylaw enforcement issue, there are going to be charges laid. You do not want to be anywhere near that. That's not your responsibility. historically, it's been elected officials should not be interfering with the court process when charges are laid. Your responsibility as part of council making the decision to put the bylaw in place that contains the penalty provision, or appoints the person as the statutory officer to enforce, for example, the building code. Be very cautious around trying to interfere with an investigation and potential charges that may result from it. That is something to be very cautious about.
If you're not satisfied that staff are dealing with the systems of handling complaints or the systems of enforcing bylaws appropriately, and you think that the staff aren't what's the word, competent in this area, then get different staff as a council, quite frankly. But don't assume that you have to jump in to fill what you think is a void in the process. It usually doesn't end well, quite frankly.
The other aspect is council in effect sets the level of service for enforcement.
Yeah.
In terms of what it will fund. Are you funding it just based on complaints received, or do you have your bylaw municipal law enforcement officers out looking for issues within your community? Those are policy decisions that are made by council when you set the budget. And so if it's complaint oriented only, for example, that's a very different system than it is for bylaw enforcement people to be going around looking for offenses against any particular bylaw.
I mean, the one that is probably the hottest one in most municipalities around this issue is property standards. And getting into the weeds is often a big problem with that in more ways than one. So it's these are difficult. These are not easy and simple issues, quite frankly. We realize that, and there's expectations and questions. Let's get the expectations and the reality as close as we can together. Fred, I want to move on to a couple of other items and recognizing the time. We talked about decorum, and it's a subject that doesn't come up hardly ever in most discussion. At least it didn't before the former president of the United States took office. But when it came out of a judicial decision, but it appears in every municipal bylaw. And in that context, it has to do with orderliness and the conventions of polite behavior. And in a council meeting, a mayor or chair has a statutory duty to maintain decorum as a result of the procedure bylaw. And in fact, he or she is given extraordinary powers to deal with people who don't behave in an appropriate fashion, because the head of council can expel them from a meeting, can ask them to leave. And if they don't leave, can recess the meeting and call for appropriate enforcement officer to remove someone from a meeting. Rarely happens, but I can direct you to a YouTube video in Oshawa where somebody was dragged by the heels. If the head of council, however, in a mild way, doesn't maintain order, or something passes, or they for some reason like the lack of decorum that a member is showing or a citizen is showing, any member of council can raise a point of order. It'll be in your procedure bylaw. And the point should include what section of the bylaw that is not being followed in the opinion of the member. And the chair then has to rule. If the chair, if you don't like the chair's ruling, and the chair says, oh no, don't worry about it, let him go on, it's okay. Then the ruling of the chair can be appealed by any member to the council for a vote without debate as to whether or not the ruling stands. You can find this in your procedure bylaw, I bet you. just I'll bet you $10 of Fred's money that it's in there. There's no doubt about that. In fact, it'll go $20 of your money, Fred. Well, let's talk a little bit about what's appropriate behavior. Well, one of the things that we don't ever want to see in a council meeting or in a municipal workforce is bullying. And bullying is very clearly defined. The use of force, coercion, or a threat to abuse or aggressively dominate or intimidate. I think we all know what bullying behavior is like. It's a subcategory of aggressive behavior. It isn't necessarily physical, but it's got 3 minimum criteria: hostile intent, imbalance of power, and repetition over a period of time. That's bullying. Think about it from the schoolyard point of view. That was the old consideration: schoolyard bullying. It was the bigger kid who was the bully. That's what we thought. It was usually there was some physical threat, and it was repeated. That was bullying. It may not actually be included specifically in your workplace harassment and violence prevention policy, but clearly it meets the definition of a harassment, and in fact exceeds that definition. So that's one to keep in mind. It's rare that it shows up in a council meeting. It might show up from a member of public. It might show up from a member of council towards another member of council in an attempt to intimidate, or by a member of council to staff. It's rare, but we have to put it out there because it's important to understand it. Harassment, you've all been trained so many times on this, but you can probably repeat the definition yourself. It's a course of vexatious comment or behavior against a worker in a workplace. It's known or ought reasonably be known to be unwelcome. And it includes sexual harassment. And it's important to remember that workplace means any land, premises, location, or thing at, upon, or where, or in which a member works, or worker works. So it's been held to be in a council meeting. It's been held to be in a municipal workplace, or in the community if people normally work externally in the community as opposed to the town hall. It could be at a conference. It could be in a car on the way to a conference. I think it can now be on the internet, okay, because people actually work there. So think about it. Emails can be there. So it's workplace harassment. People need to be very cautious about workplace harassment. And if you're a member of council, you can actually find yourself having to deal with allegations of harassment, whether it be, and I'll mention this in a minute, whether it's through the code of conduct or whether it's through the complaint to the Ministry of Labor, or in some cases to the Human Rights Tribunal. So all of these sorts of things can come into play. Doesn't happen often, but it's got to be on your radar. Especially as we get closer to elections, because I think it's going to be more difficult. We've seen people allegedly tossing gravel at the Prime Minister. We've seen people with signs. We've seen harassment, not maybe in this definition, but what appears to be harassment. Well, I think it is harassment in terms of some of the medical workplaces across the province in recent weeks or recent days. So that's a major issue. What we often see, and is maybe not bullying, maybe not harassment, but we're seeing more workplace incivility. And the psychologists define it as low intensity deviant behavior with ambiguous intent to harm the target. These behaviors are characteristically rude and discourteous, display a lack of regard for others. It's the kind of behavior where somebody in a setting makes a sarcastic or critical remark, and somebody turns to somebody and said, "Did so-and-so just say what I thought they said? Or did I hear that right?" It could be sarcasm. Sometimes it's, eye rolling. Or you ever see anybody in a meeting just roll their eyes and toss their pen in the air. It might be a rude put down, or gee, I would have expected a more fulsome report from somebody in your position. Those are the kinds of things. And again, I'm not suggesting that this has happened in your municipality, but I've seen it happen elsewhere. So what we build into this is the knowledge of having dealt with hundreds of municipalities over the years, and the kinds of unfortunate behavior that we really want to discourage people from exhibiting. When I make reference to public reprimands, there's one golden rule of discipline or expressing unhappiness with somebody's professional behavior. It's you praise in public and you criticize in private. That's why you have the ability to go into closed session for personal matters about identifiable individuals. Obviously, praise is personal matter, but you don't go into close for praise, but you should for criticism. So what's the process for dealing with inappropriate behavior? Well, staff can, they deal with it on a regular basis. Management has a responsibility to deal with it, and they deal with it directly. If it's serious enough, they will engage an independent investigator, or in some cases, a staff member has the ability to, in fact, I think in all cases, if they feel that they won't be dealt with appropriately in the organization, to go directly to the Ministry of Labor. The Ministry of Labor in these situations, I always like to say, takes no prisoners. They're known to be, or assume, they're felt to be assuming that you're guilty, and you got to deal with it when they show up. With respect to violent incidents, and again, we've unfortunately had to deal with some of these where people have been seriously injured in the workplace, not at a council meeting, thankfully. But well, I shouldn't say that. It happened years ago, but the normal practice may automatically involve the police and suspension of both parties. That's not an unusual thing to have certainly in a staff code. It's one that is not taken lightly at all on staff. For elected officials, again, depending on the behavior, it's probably going to be the Municipal Integrity Commissioner. If a complaint is filed, it might be the Ministry of Labor, and it might even be the police authority, particularly if the Municipal Integrity Commissioner thinks it involves a criminal matter. The head of council, again, has this responsibility to maintain decorum at a council meeting. There are some integrity commissioners that say, no, I don't investigate complaints about inappropriate comments at council meetings. That's the job of the head of council. You might, Mr. Mayor, wish to have a conversation with your integrity commissioner at some point, if you can, to ask what his or her particular position is on that, just so you're well aware. But bottom line is, management doesn't investigate elected officials' behavior. It's not the role for management. And you can actually have two bodies investigating a single complaint at the same time. I've seen it happen in a what should we say, a large town south of you, but obviously not in Dufferin County. You should be aware that, and you probably were participants in it, that the Minister of Municipal Affairs had launched a program of consultation using the services of Jill Dunlop, who was at that point a parliamentary assistant for women's issues. She's now a minister, to consult with respect to codes of conduct and penalties, and to whether or not they were still appropriate in their current form. The minister was quite concerned about some of the reports that have been produced and some of the behaviors. I think, and this again is just my opinion, that we're going to see more requirements for codes of conduct. So they're going to look like some of what we see in corporate codes. So I can't remember if this was AT&T or Coca-Cola, but it was a large multinational company that does business in Canada. And its code of conduct for its staff, its board members, its contractors, everyone involved with doing business for that corporation, was that engaging in any direct behavior that's offensive, intimidating, malicious, etc., regardless of, and it brings in human rights issues, it brings in gender identity, it brings in all of the appropriate matters into one coded statement. And I would not be surprised that we see this kind of statements coming to be built into the Municipal Act and to be built into municipal codes of conduct. That's what I would predict. And I'd bet my money on this one as opposed to Fred's. That's how comfortable I am with it. One integrity commissioner that we have dealt with over the years, he said, be sensitive to the possibility that your words and actions will be perceived as unwelcome. This is Robert Williams, former professor of law from the KW Kitchener-Waterloo area. He says, council members should be sensitive to how your words affect others, but that should not shun engaging lively discussion. And that lively discussion he's talking about is between members of council, as long as it's respectful in the council floor. That's members. There can't be lively discussion on a council floor between a senior staff member or a consultant and a member of council. Why? Well, there's a power imbalance very clearly. The process doesn't lend itself. The staff are not the official opposition. And I was just dealing today with a municipality where there's a very strong division on council about the construction of a new fire hall. And there's an expectation that, the CAO has made it clear to the fire chief that, and the consultant, that it's the facts of the proposal, it's the facts of the design, it's the professional advice of the fire chief, and it's the professional advice of the architect that are being submitted in the report. And their job is not to argue what may be the perceptions of a member of council if they think it's inappropriate. Their job is to present their best advice. It's up to council to debate the merits of that advice and those recommendations. It's an interesting situation in this municipality. That is the municipality I was dealing with before. But words matter. Right, Fred?
Well, I was going to say on that previous slide, Nigel, the lively debate is really good and it can be really interesting. I think, though, the issue is not, don't make it personal.
Yeah. Keep
it on the issues, keep it focused. And I think that's what makes for good debate and good decisions at the end of the day by council. This next slide just talks about words matter, and that's really true. Be really cautious about the words that you use and be aware that there is always an imbalance. Council members have or are perceived to have a greater power than your staff members and indeed the public. So be cautious about the words that you use. Nigel, we have a few slides that talk about prevention. Let's just go through these fairly quickly. We talked a lot about the role of the head of council and the importance of being effective and efficient at council meetings. And I think that requires a knowledge of your procedure bylaw. I think it requires a knowledge of the agenda that you have before you at any particular meeting, what's in the code of conduct, what your authority is in terms of removing someone from council meetings. As I said before, I spent a lot of years in Sudbury, and one of the defining factors in Sudbury that really had an impact, and this is back now in the 70s and 80s, In the 70s, a mayor of one of the local municipalities was shot chairing a council meeting. Wasn't killed, but he was shot at the meeting. So everyone at council in Sudbury, whether it was the city or the other area municipalities of the region, were very sensitive to issues that could erupt at a council meeting and could cause a dangerous situation. So the heads of council always erred on the side of either recessing or bringing in help if it was necessary by having uniformed officers come in. It was very sensitive, and that was back in those days. And I think the risk today is probably significant higher for all of us in this field. So mayor's training, really important. We talked about service request systems, and I don't think we have to add more to that. I just think it's an area of prevention, and it's an area that I think councils and members of councils and administration have to do well. The next one deals with training. Let me just make an observation about training. I think members of council, particularly after just before the election, yes, I think people should be trained before the election, but after the election in what's called orientation, I think there needs to be a balance between what I've always referred to as in-house and out-house training. And in-house training is training within your municipality by your staff or by someone you might bring in to help staff do that. It's very specific to your organization. Out-house training, though, is different. It is, for example, in the county, all the municipalities in the county getting together and bringing someone in. It could be AMO training. It could be Amberley Gavel doing a training on a county basis. You need to have that balance. It's really important to do that. But I think that the more focused training internally is the significant one. The other important aspect is you can't just train people once. You're doing this now 3 years into the term. And a number of municipalities have been doing this over the last year. I think you need some training after a year. It's important to cover that. People don't hear everything the first time through, particularly if they're newly elected. It makes a difference. The fourth item is one that I will often go on for probably half an hour, maybe longer. I think this is one of the defining characteristics of an effective council meeting, or an ineffective council meeting, if you will. And it is the ambush. And what do I mean by ambush? Well, I mean this. It's something that you are not expecting on the agenda. Here's my rule, and it's been my rule since I got into this business, and I learned some of the principles of it early. When I walk into a council meeting, whether I'm a member of staff or a member of council or the public, I should know with certainty, with reasonable certainty, the decisions that council is being asked to make at this meeting. It's really important to set those parameters and understand that. But council can get itself ambushed, and often you can read the procedure bylaw and see how it happens. It can happen by some municipalities have this public get to speak at a meeting without being a delegation. And they can just throw anything into the meeting that will completely throw you off and won't be expected. And frankly, most councils don't look very good after a while doing this. I did a procedure bylaw about 6 months ago and recommended that this be removed from the municipality's bylaw. And council decided to leave it in. And I got a call from the clerk just the other day saying council now wants to get it out. People are starting to get really nasty on the comments. So be careful allowing the public to come in and make comment without having some control of it through your delegation process. Staff can ambush council by things like addendums, putting items on the agenda at the last minute. that you haven't had notice about. Be really cautious. Staff have to be really cautious about addendums. We have the ability now, if something gets written a couple of days ahead, that it doesn't just get dropped on the council table, it can be circulated ahead of time. The last way council gets ambushed is by one of the members. Somebody who wants to raise something because it's urgent or it's so important we have to deal with it. You haven't told some other members of council, you haven't told staff, and you haven't told the public. Frankly, I don't think you're being fair by doing that. And I think it's really important. Council's members tend to lose trust in each other if this happens too often. And I've talked to a number of councils over the years where this has been a huge issue. So beware the ambushes. Eliminate as many as you possibly can. You should know when you go into the meeting what decisions and what deliberations council is going to be making at that meeting. Nigel, do you want to cover the fifth one on social media?
Sure. I do want to comment on the ambush too, Fred. Often the ambush, particularly, well, sometimes from staff, but often from citizens, is people, if they want you to make a decision in a hurry, it's because they want you to only consider the facts that they want to present to you. And that's, be cautious. If it's an emergency means something dealing with the personal health and or safety of individuals or property in a significant way, then fine. But if it's not an emergency, it usually can wait for a complete report. Here's something that I think every municipality needs to really be thinking about, is to make sure that they have and or update, if they already have, their municipal communication strategy and their social media policy well in advance of the 2022 election. Now, I can't tell you what it has to say. There are people that know this better than I do. But in terms of the corporate social media policy and how people receive information from the municipality, and also the municipal communication strategy, both of those are, I think, going to be exceptionally important. There will be individuals, whether they're current members of council or prospective members of council who are running, who are going to be using social media. That's just a fact of life. You want to make sure that there is a place that citizens can turn, whether it's social media or whether it's some other electronic communications, in terms of getting factual information reflecting the decisions of council. And so it's just, I think, really important to get that in place before the election starts. And it'll start almost the day the clock turns 2022. So council needs to have this process in place, if you don't already, by the end of this year, in order to get yourself well positioned, so that the corporation and you as individuals aren't caught by it. It's challenging in a lot of places, but for those of you who follow Twitter, those of you who are on Facebook, you know what some of the challenges, some of the opportunities, and some of the challenges that are out there. So, and that is our last slide. We're a few minutes over where we thought we would be, but we're well within parameters, Mr. Mayor. We're happy to address any other questions that come up.
All right. Thanks very much, gentlemen. I see Councillor Bonato has a question.
Just going back on the social media, anything that's involving the town should be put out on the town social media only, or is it? It's not really the job of councillors to put out that information, correct?
Well, if you recall, there's two places. One is you should have a communications policy that reflects how not only your minutes are available to people because that's where the decisions are, but if there's a direction to communicate the results or the policies in a way beyond what the minutes show, that's a staff function. So that's part of your communications policy. Many municipalities your size now have a designated communications officer. It may not be their full-time job, but it's a significant part of some individual's job. It's not just something you add onto the clerk's list of things to do. The second one is the head of council's got a responsibility, as we said before, to communicate the decisions of council. But I think, Councillor, you're quite right. It doesn't stop a member of council from communicating what a council's decision is. But you need to have a pretty robust place in there so that people aren't relying solely on members of council to get the corporate message out. Because that's a significant job. And I don't expect that individual members of council will be putting out all of the corporate messages with the same degree of interest. So, and if you were trying to be an independent journalist as a councillor, then why don't you let staff do that for you? Put a policy in place to do it.
Agreed. That's why I try not to get on Facebook at all if I can. The other question I kind of had, if we're finding that when we pass information on from citizens regarding complaints or issues that they have, and we're not getting back reports or the complaints still continue on, at what point is that wise to bring it up in council?
Is it a council decision? I think the place to bring up a question about the enforcement is with the CAO, quite frankly, rather than bring it up in council, because you bring it up in council, it just is like without anybody being prepared, it's like a bit of a stink bomb in a council meeting. Okay. It's just, if you brought something to the attention and referred something to the public works manager and told people to go there, and somebody gets back and says, I haven't heard from the public works manager and I left a message there a week ago, have a conversation with the CAO. Okay, because the CAO is the one who's ultimately responsible for the tracking of the system. That's the way I do it. I wouldn't do it at a council meeting. That's just an attempt to embarrass somebody.
That's it for my questions.
Okay.
Anybody else? No. Okay. Well, it was a lot of information to take in, but I think very helpful. And as you say, I think going forward, this is the kind of thing that will be helpful on a somewhat regular basis. But certainly appreciate your time and your expertise, and I'm sure next council will probably see you gentlemen back. So.
Well, I don't know about you, Fred. I'd just like to say that, I really appreciate the work and the effort and the sacrifice that people make when they stand for elected office. It's really rare that you would find somebody who was ever a municipal manager or a municipal CAO who would ever venture to stand for office, because they know what you people go through in terms of what you have to put up for what you get for it. So want to say thank you for doing that, because it is in many ways it's somewhat thankless. You don't get too many calls saying thank you. You tend to get more calls saying, why haven't you?
Well, I appreciate that on behalf of council, and I will say, sort of as a parting comment, that I do think we are quite fortunate here in the town of Shelburne and with this particular group. I'm sure we're not perfect. There's always room for improvement, and that's why we reach out to gentlemen like you. But I think by and large, we have a very functional group that works well together, and I think tries to carry the ball forward on behalf of the community as best we can. as imperfect individuals. But that being said, thanks again for your time and your thoughtfulness. Denise, was there anything you wanted to add before we wrap up?
No, Mary Mills, thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, Fred, Nigel, all the
Thank
best. Take care.
Thank you.
Have a good balance of your meeting.
Thank
Hope
you.
it isn't too long a night. Bye for now.
Guys. All right, I know we have a couple of guests waiting, but that has been a rather long session, so I would like to take just a short break to allow everybody a chance to stretch their legs and do whatever they have to do. So why don't we try to keep it, 5-7 minutes, take a quick break, and we'll be back here in a few.
Okay.